Pearl Fairchild had buried a husband, a daughter, and every soft feeling she ever had, all in the same bitter winter of 1882, and she had made up her mind since then that she would never again let a living soul close enough to take anything else from her. The town of Dustcreek, Texas, sat in a shallow valley between two worn-down ridges that the wind had carved into shapes that looked almost cruel in certain lights. It was not a beautiful town, not by any stretch of generous description, but it was a surviving town, and that was the highest praise most folks in that part of the country could offer anything. The main street was a quarter-mile of packed earth, permanently grooved by wagon wheels, lined with a general store, a livery stable, a church that needed a new roof, a saloon that needed a new everything, and a scattering of homes that ranged from sturdy to barely standing. There was a doctor who mostly pulled teeth, a sheriff who mostly drank, and a collection of men who had various ideas about how Pearl Fairchild ought to be spending her time, now that 2 years had passed since the death of her husband Robert. Robert Fairchild had been a decent man. Not a great one, but decent. He had built Pearl a home with proper floors and a covered porch. He had been patient and not given to meanness. He had worked hard and not gambled away what he earned. When the fever took him in January of 1882, Pearl had grieved him honestly, and that grief had been a clean and understandable thing. But it was the other grief, the one that came 12 days after Robert's burial, that had changed her in ways no one in Dustcreek fully understood. Her daughter Clara had been 7 years old. She had been small for her age and bright in the particular way of children, who ask too many questions that adults cannot properly answer. The same fever that took Robert had been smoldering in Clara all that time, held at bay by some stubborn child's constitution, and then one night it broke through all at once and consumed her before morning. Pearl had sat beside that small bed through the whole of that night, holding a tiny hand that kept growing lighter and lighter in her grasp. And when dawn came and the hand was completely still, something essential inside Pearl Fairchild closed itself off like a window being shuttered from the inside. She had kept Clara's locket. It was a simple oval of silver, thin as a coin, with a clasp that stuck slightly and needed patience to open. Inside was a tiny photograph of Clara at 5 years old, seated very seriously in the photographer's chair in Abilene, wearing a dress with a white collar. Pearl had given that locket to Clara on her 6th birthday, a present saved for and chosen carefully, and Clara had worn it every single day of the remaining year of her life. After the burial, Pearl had gone to retrieve it from the undertaker, and the man had looked at her with the particular embarrassed misery of someone who has bad news of a small nature. The locket had not been on Clara's person when she was prepared for burial. It had simply vanished. Pearl had turned the house over looking for it. She had searched every drawer, every pocket, every corner of every room. The locket was gone, and she could not explain it, and the loss of it sat inside her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. The men of Dustcreek had begun their attentions about 6 months after Robert's burial, which was, by the social mathematics of 1882, approximately the correct interval to express interest in a widow without appearing entirely without decency. Pearl was 31 years old, which was not old but was also not young by the standards of the frontier, and she was handsome in a steady, unhurried way, with dark eyes and an expression that most people read as composure but which was really something more like careful distance. She had land. She had the house Robert had built. She had a kitchen garden and 6 chickens, and a mule named Patience whose name was an irony, and she had demonstrated that she was capable of managing all of it without assistance. Hector Baines had come first, a cattle rancher with a large spread east of town, and a personality roughly as appealing as an empty field. He had arrived at her door with his hat in his hands and a prepared speech that he delivered with the wooden efficiency of a man reading a legal document. Pearl had let him finish, offered him a cup of water since she had nothing warmer to offer him in either refreshment or feeling, and told him plainly that she was not looking to remarry. He had taken this with a dignity she respected, tipped his hat, and ridden away, and she had thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the following 18 months, 5 more men had made their intentions known with varying degrees of tact and varying degrees of dignity upon rejection. There had been Dale Whitmore, the grain merchant, who had brought flowers she had not asked for and lingered on her porch until she asked him to leave. There had been young Arthur Prout, who was 23 and sweet but misguided, who had written her an actual letter which she had read with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. There had been the new man at the assay office whose name she kept forgetting, who had tried twice. There had been Sheriff Lon Meade himself, who had shown up on a Sunday looking scrubbed and earnest, which had been almost worse than if he had come smelling of whiskey, because at least then she would have had an easier reason to refuse. And there had been Thomas Gale, who owned the saloon and who had made his offer with a kind of cheerful commercial confidence that suggested he considered marriage roughly equivalent to a business proposition, which Pearl supposed in some historical context it often was, but which she nonetheless found deeply unappealing. She had refused all of them. She had refused them politely. She had refused them without cruelty, because she was not a cruel woman. But she had refused them with an absolute firmness that left no room for interpretation, and gradually the men of Dustcreek had come to understand that Pearl Fairchild was not available, not in any sense that mattered, and they had adjusted their social behavior accordingly. This suited Pearl. She had her routine. She woke before light, fed the chickens, tended the garden, cooked for herself, took in some sewing work for money, and went to bed when darkness made further activity impractical. She was not happy exactly, but she was stable, and stability in 1882 in a place like Dustcreek was its own kind of achievement. She had people she was cordial with. She had a friendship with Dora Hatch, who ran the general store with her husband Abe, and who was the only person in town who never pushed Pearl toward anything she had not asked for. She attended church on Sundays not because her faith was still intact, but because the routine of it gave shape to her week. She was managing. She was managing fine. And then one afternoon in September of 1884, a man rode into Dustcreek on a bay horse that had seen considerable miles, and came to a stop in front of the general store with the particular unhurried manner of someone who had not yet decided whether he was staying. His name was Calvin Sullivan, and he was 34 years old, and he had been riding for a long time. Pearl did not see him arrive. She was in Dora Hatch's store picking up flour and needles, standing at the counter while Dora wrapped things in brown paper and talked about the Hendersons' new baby, when the door opened and the man stepped in out of the September afternoon light. Pearl noticed him the way you notice any stranger in a small town, which is completely and immediately, because strangers in small towns are notable in the way that ordinary things at home are not. She registered height, build, a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor living, dark hair going gray at the temples, and a brown leather coat that had the look of something relied upon rather than merely worn. He was carrying saddlebags over one arm and his hat in his other hand, holding it against his chest in the unconscious politeness of a man who had been raised to remove it indoors. He nodded to Dora first, which was the right instinct in that establishment, and asked if she had a room he could inquire about, and Dora told him to try Mrs. Calwell's boarding house 2 doors down, and the man thanked her with a brief, genuine smile and turned to go, and that was when Pearl noticed the chain. It was hanging from the breast pocket of his coat, just an inch of silver chain, thin and delicate, the kind of chain that belonged to something small. It was the particular chain that Pearl had spent 2 years believing she would never see again. She knew it the way you know the face of someone you love, not by analysis but by immediate and absolute recognition, and the knowledge of it hit her so suddenly that she made an involuntary sound, barely more than a breath, but enough. The man stopped. He turned just slightly, because the sound had been behind him and directed at nothing in particular, and his eyes found Pearl standing at the counter with her hand pressed flat against the wood and an expression on her face that was not quite composed anymore. "Ma'am," he said, because he was the kind of man who registered when something had gone wrong near him. Pearl pressed her lips together. She was not going to accuse a stranger in a shop. She was not going to reach across the room and grab at a piece of chain hanging from a man she had never met. She breathed in once carefully and said, "Nothing. Excuse me. I apologize." He looked at her for a moment, the way people sometimes do when they are not entirely convinced by what they have been told, and then he nodded again, replaced his hat, and walked out the door. "You all right?" Dora asked, leaning across the counter with the specific attention of a woman who had known Pearl for years and could read the variations in her stillness. "That chain," Pearl said. "The one in his pocket." Dora had not noticed it. She said so. Pearl explained, slowly and precisely, what she had seen, and Dora listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Pearl valued most about her. "Could be wrong," Dora said carefully when Pearl had finished. "I know what that chain looks like," Pearl said. "I bought it in Abilene. I know what it looks like." There was a pause. "Are you going to go after him?" Dora asked. Pearl had already picked up her parcels. "I'm going to find out," she said, which was a different answer. She found Calvin Sullivan at Mrs. Calwell's boarding house on the porch, speaking with the landlady about room rates. He saw Pearl coming up the walk with the direct, purposeful stride of someone who had something to say, and he excused himself from Mrs. Calwell with a politeness that was natural rather than performed, and he came to meet Pearl at the gate, which she thought later was either brave or intuitive, possibly both. "I'm Pearl Fairchild," she said. "I live here in Dustcreek, and I don't know how to ask this without sounding like I've lost my reason, but I need to ask you about the chain in your coat pocket." He looked at her with a steadiness that she recognized as something other than blankness. It was the look of a person who was taking her seriously. "The locket," he said. The word came out of him quietly, and it landed on Pearl like a physical thing. "Yes," she said. "The locket." He reached into his breast pocket with 2 careful fingers and drew out the silver oval, the clasp that stuck slightly, the thin chain that she had purchased in an Abilene shop on a day when Clara had been standing beside her with mud on her boots and 100 opinions about everything. He held it out on his open palm, and Pearl stared at it, and did not immediately take it because she was afraid that if she moved too fast she would break something that she could not name. "Where did you get it?" she asked. "That's a long story," he said. "Would you let me tell it?" Pearl looked at him. She was a woman who had become very good at reading people in the 2 years since she had stopped being willing to trust them easily. She read this man now, carefully, looking for something that would tell her to walk away, and found instead a kind of earnest weight behind his eyes that she did not know what to do with. "There's a bench," she said, "out behind the church. No one goes there in the afternoon. You can tell me there." He took his horse to the livery first. He was the kind of man who saw to his horse before he saw to himself, and Pearl noted this without quite meaning to, and filed it somewhere. The bench behind the church was an old one, weathered to silver, set against the back wall out of the wind. Pearl sat at one end and Calvin Sullivan sat at the other, leaving a proper distance between them, and he turned his hat slowly in his hands the way men do when they are gathering a story from somewhere difficult. "I came from up north," he said. "Wyoming Territory before that, Montana before that. I've been moving around for a while. I was working a cattle drive coming down through Indian Territory, and we came through a hard stretch, and there was a trading post near the river where we stopped to resupply. The man running the post had a box of goods he was selling off, said they'd been left behind by a traveler who hadn't come back for them, and I looked through the box the way you look through things when you're bored and have a minute to spare, and I found the locket at the bottom." "What made you take it?" Pearl asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Something felt wrong about it being in that box," he said. "It was the kind of thing that belongs to somebody, not the kind of thing you leave behind on purpose." I asked the man about it, and he said he'd had it near on 2 years. Said it had come with a load of goods from a freight outfit passing through. He had no more story than that. He paused again. I bought it from him. I didn't have any plan about it. I just couldn't leave it there. Pearl was looking at her own hands, which were folded in her lap very precisely. I've been carrying it, Calvin said, for about 8 months. I told myself I'd figure out where it came from eventually. I've been in 6 towns since then and hadn't found anything. Then I came here. Open it, Pearl said. Can you open it? The clasp sticks, he said. Yes, she said. It does. He worked the clasp with the patience of someone who had done it before, and the locket opened, and he held it out so she could see the tiny photograph inside. The small, serious face in the photographer's chair. The white collar. Pearl's vision blurred for a moment and she blinked it back deliberately. Her name was Clara, Pearl said. She was my daughter. She died in January of 1882. She was 7 years old. Calvin Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said, and it was the simple, direct kind of sorry that did not try to do too much, the kind that acknowledged the size of a thing without pretending to fix it. How the locket ended up 2 years away from here in a trading post box, Pearl said, I don't know that I'll ever understand. No, he agreed. Some things travel in ways that don't make a clean story. She reached out and he placed the locket into her open hand and her fingers closed around it and she sat holding it for a while without speaking. He did not try to fill the silence. He sat with it, which was a thing Pearl had not expected from a stranger. After some minutes she said, What brings you to Dustcreek, Mr. Sullivan, and not just the road? He seemed to consider whether to answer fully, and then he did. I've been thinking about stopping for a while, he said. I've been moving since my wife died 7 years ago. I have a trade. I'm a farrier, trained up right, and I can do general blacksmith work. A town the size of this one usually has need of that kind of skill. I thought I'd see if this was a place worth staying in. Your wife, Pearl said, not prying but acknowledging. Mary, he said. Fever. In Wyoming, 1877. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who has said a thing so many times that the words have worn smooth, but the weight underneath them had not worn away at all. They sat there for another few minutes while the September light moved slowly across the church wall, and then Pearl stood and smoothed her skirt. I'll tell Dora Hatch you're here, she said. Her husband Abe is on the town council. If you want to set up a proper smithy, they'd be the people to talk to. The town's been making do without a full blacksmith for 2 years. She paused. Thank you for keeping the locket safe. I'm glad it found its way home, Calvin said, and he said it simply, without embellishment. Pearl walked back to her house with the locket clenched in her fist, and she sat at her kitchen table for a long time. And she did not cry because she had finished that particular kind of crying a long time ago. But she held the locket in both hands and felt something shift very slightly in the place inside her that had been shut for so long that she had stopped thinking about what was behind it. Calvin Sullivan stayed. He had a conversation with Abe Hatch and the town council that resulted in an arrangement for use of the old smithy space on the south end of Main Street, which had stood idle since old Pete Garner's hands had gotten too stiff for the work. He spent 3 days cleaning out the space and getting the forge operational, and by the end of that week he was taking work, and by the end of the second week the word had gone out to the surrounding farms that Dustcreek had a real blacksmith again, and men began coming in from 10 miles out to have horses shod and equipment repaired, and Calvin Sullivan became, quietly and without particular fanfare, a part of the town. Pearl was aware of him the way you become aware of something that has come to occupy a regular place in your field of view. She passed the smithy on her way to Dora's store. She heard the ring of his hammer on certain mornings when the wind was right. She saw him at Sunday church, sitting 2 pews behind her, hat in his lap, attending with the honest and slightly uncomfortable manner of a person who is not sure how much they believe but is making the effort anyway. He did not seek her out. He did not create excuses to come to her door. He greeted her when they crossed paths with a straightforward friendliness that asked nothing of her, and she found that this was the most surprising thing about him. The men who had come to her before had all wanted something from her, even if it was something they believed was also good for her. Calvin Sullivan did not appear to want anything from her, and this disarmed Pearl in a way that all the wanting never had. It was Dora who named it first, as Dora tended to do with things Pearl was not ready to name herself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and Pearl was in the store, and Dora was not even pretending to be doing something other than watching Pearl's face, while Calvin Sullivan walked past the front window on his way back to the smithy. "You watch him," Dora said. "I do not," Pearl said. "You've watched him go past this window 6 times this week," Dora said, with the comfortable certainty of a woman who has known another woman long enough to simply state the truth without apology. Pearl put down the spool of thread she was looking at. "Dora, I'm not saying anything about it," Dora said, which was not accurate. "I'm just naming what I see. He brought me my daughter's locket," Pearl said. "I'm grateful to him. Gratitude and watching are different things," said Dora, in the way that meant she was not arguing but she was also not agreeing. Pearl bought her thread and left, but she thought about what Dora had said as she walked home, and she thought about it while she cooked supper, and she thought about it while she sat on her porch in the cooling October evening watching the sky go dark, and she admitted to herself in the privacy of her own mind that Dora was not entirely wrong. She had been noticing Calvin Sullivan. Not in the way she had been noticed by the men who had come to her door, not with any plan or intention behind it, but in the plain and involuntary way that you notice something that has become important to you without your permission. She did not know what to do with that, so she set it aside, as she set most difficult things aside, and went to bed. The first real conversation they had after the one on the church bench happened on a Wednesday morning in late October, when Pearl came out to find that Patience, the mule, had thrown a shoe overnight, and was standing in the yard with the tolerant, long-suffering expression of a mule who has lived through worse. Pearl did not have another option that she could think of except the smithy, and she led Patience down the main street with the brisk, practical air of a woman managing a situation. Calvin saw her coming and came out of the smithy, squinting in the morning light, and looked at the mule with the professional attention of a man who has spent years with animals. "Lost a shoe," Pearl said. "I see that," he said, going to a knee to look at the hoof with an easy, unhurried competence that Pearl found herself noticing. He stood back up. "Leave her with me for an hour, I'll sort it out." "What do I owe you?" Pearl asked. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was warm but careful, like a man who has learned to be careful with warmth. "Let's call it nothing," he said. "That's not how a business works," Pearl said. "I know how a business works," he said mildly. "Consider it a thank you for the word you put in with Abe Hatch." Pearl could have argued this. She chose not to. She went to Dora's store while Patience was being seen to, and she came back an hour later, and the mule was in the yard outside the smithy with a new shoe fitted perfectly, standing with rather more dignity than she had managed all morning. "She's well-tempered," Calvin said, coming out to hand over the lead rope. "She's miserable-tempered and she knows it," Pearl said, "but she's consistent." He laughed, short and genuine, and Pearl realized she had not heard him laugh before, and it was a good sound, the kind that meant what it appeared to mean. She took Patience home. She did not think about the laugh. She thought about it for the rest of the day. In November, the weather began to turn, the way Texas weather does when it finally decides to take the season seriously, and the social life of Dustcreek contracted around fires and hearths, and the church hall on Friday evenings when someone usually had a fiddle. Pearl attended these gatherings because Dora asked her to and because she was not, despite what some in town seemed to assume, entirely antisocial. She sat with Dora and Abe and contributed to conversations and drank coffee that was always too strong and watched the dancing with a neutrality that she had cultivated into something almost convincing. Calvin was there too, the second Friday of November. He stood along the wall with a few of the other single men in town, holding a cup of coffee, looking at the dancing with a kind of quiet enjoyment that did not require him to participate. Pearl became aware of him by degrees. The way you become aware of a sound that has been present for a while without your quite registering it. And when their eyes met across the room, it was the natural result of two people who have been aware of each other's presence without looking directly. He did not look away immediately, and neither did she. And then Dora said something to Pearl, and she turned her attention back to the conversation. And when she looked again, he was talking to Abe Hatch about something to do with a fence repair. The following Friday, during a lull when the fiddle player was resting his fingers and the conversation filled the room in a general hum, Calvin made his way across the hall to where Pearl was sitting. He sat in the empty chair beside her, leaving a proper distance, and said, "I've been wanting to ask you something." Pearl set down her cup. "Ask," she said. "Your daughter," he said carefully. "Clara, you don't have to talk about her if you'd rather not, but I've been wondering about her, what she was like." Pearl was quiet for a moment, and something complicated moved across her face, because the question itself was unexpected. People in Dustcreek did not ask about Clara. They referred to her death obliquely in the context of Pearl's grief and situation, but no one asked about what Clara had been like as a person, because the child had been dead for nearly 3 years and the living tended to focus on the living. She was curious, Pearl said. She wanted to know everything. She would ask questions and not wait for the answers before she had 3 more ready. She collected things: rocks, feathers, pressed flowers. She had a whole box under her bed full of things she thought were interesting. Pearl paused. She made friends with every animal she came across. She was never afraid of them. That mule Patience followed her around like a dog when Clara was small. She had a quality about her where animals just trusted her. Pearl stopped because she had said more than she intended. Calvin was listening with his full attention, the coffee cup in both hands, not looking at her in a way that felt like pity but in a way that felt like interest, real interest. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She was," Pearl said. "She was entirely herself. She never had a moment of being someone else. She looked at her own hands. I miss that. Watching someone be entirely themselves." There was a brief silence between them that was not uncomfortable. "Mary was like that too," Calvin said. "She had a way of taking up whatever room she was in that had nothing to do with noise or fuss. She was just present. You always knew when she was there." He looked down at his cup. "And you always knew when she wasn't." Pearl looked at him then, really looked, and she saw in his face something she recognized from her own mirror. Not current grief, which was raw and close to the surface, but the settled kind. The kind that has been lived with long enough that it has become part of the landscape rather than an obstacle in it. She recognized it because she had the same thing, and she had never expected to see it so clearly on another person's face. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that you will ever stop carrying it?" "No," he said with perfect calm, "but I think you stop carrying it alone eventually, if you let yourself." Pearl did not answer that, but she did not move away from it either, which was itself a kind of answer. When the fiddler started up again and the room filled with the warm, scraping music of a reel, Calvin stood and offered her his hand with a look that was more question than presumption. Pearl looked at the hand. She had not danced since before Robert died. She thought about that. She thought about the way this man had listened to her talk about Clara without flinching. She thought about 8 months of carrying a locket across 6 states because it felt wrong to leave it in a box. She took his hand. They danced one reel, not perfectly, because Pearl was rusty and Calvin had the slight stiffness of a large man trying to be light-footed, but with a genuine effort on both their parts that resulted in something functional and even pleasant. When it ended, she stepped back and thanked him and went back to sit with Dora, and Dora pressed her lips together very hard to not say anything. "Don't," Pearl said. "I'm not saying a word," Dora said. Over the weeks that followed, Pearl found herself in conversation with Calvin Sullivan in the natural way that happens when two people exist in the same small orbit and are no longer avoiding each other. He stopped in at Dora's store on the same mornings Pearl often did, not because he had engineered it, or so it seemed to Pearl, but because the store opened at 7 and he started his day early and needed supplies like any working man. They talked about ordinary things. The weather, which in a Texas November was genuinely worth discussing. The state of the roads, which were suffering from autumn rains. The news coming in from outside Dustcreek, filtered through newspapers that arrived days late and travelers who arrived with their own particular slant on things. He was easy to talk to in the way that some people simply are, not effortful or performed, just present and interested, and willing to let the conversation go where it naturally went rather than steering it somewhere useful. Pearl noticed that he was this way with everyone in town, not just her. He talked to old Pete Garner, who came by the smithy most days to watch someone else do the work his hands could no longer manage, with the same attentive patience. He talked to the Henderson boy, who was 9 and fascinated by the forge, with the same quality of taking the child's interest seriously. This consistency, the fact that he was not performing a version of himself for Pearl specifically but was simply this way, made her trust what she saw. December came in cold and clear, and the town strung pine boughs along the fronts of the businesses, and the church hung a wreath on its door, and there was a general effort at festivity that Dustcreek mounted every year with the slightly determined cheer of people who know winter is hard and choose to push back at it regardless. Pearl had always found Christmas difficult since 1882. Clara had loved it with the extravagant, wholehearted love of a 7-year-old, for whom tinsel and oranges and paper chains represented the apex of human achievement. And the memory of that love was present every December like a wound that had mostly healed but still ached in the cold. She was at Dora's store on a gray afternoon in mid-December looking at fabric without particular purpose, when Calvin came in and bought peppermint candy from the jar on the counter, a somewhat unexpected purchase that made Dora raise her eyebrows. "The Henderson boy," Calvin explained, apparently anticipating the question. "He helped me sweep out the smithy yesterday. He won't take money. He's 9. He'll take candy." Pearl, who had her back partly turned looking at the fabric, smiled to herself before she turned around. "You've got that child completely convinced you're the most interesting person in Dustcreek," she said. "I have a forge," Calvin said, with a simplicity that made her smile again. "That's all it takes with a 9-year-old. He paid for his candy and stood for a moment not quite leaving, turning the small paper bag in his hands, and he said, "I was wondering if you might want to walk." "Not for any particular reason, just walk. The weather's held clear today." Pearl looked at him. She thought about Dora standing behind the counter absolutely radiating tactful silence. She thought about the fact that she had been standing here looking at fabric she did not need to buy for 15 minutes. "All right," she said. They walked south along the main street and then out along the wagon road that followed the creek for half a mile before bending east toward the Henderson and Grayson farms. The creek was low after the dry summer but still moving, and the cottonwoods along its bank had dropped their leaves and stood pale and clean against the sky. It was cold enough to see your breath but not cold enough to be uncomfortable with a good coat, and Pearl had a good coat. They talked without particular plan. Calvin told her about growing up in Missouri, the third of 5 children, on a farm that grew corn and tobacco and general stubbornness. He had come west at 20, following a cousin who had gone ahead and written enthusiastic letters about opportunity, and had found the cousin but not quite the opportunity, and had made his own opportunity instead, learning the blacksmith trade from an old man in Kansas City who had more skill than anyone Pearl had ever heard of and less patience for students who didn't concentrate. He talked about the cattle drives he had worked in his 20s, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the clarity of a person who has processed their memories into something useful rather than something raw. Pearl found herself talking more than she usually did. She talked about growing up in Tennessee, the eldest of 4, in a house that was too small and too loud, and that she had loved anyway. She talked about coming west with Robert, the hope of it, the particular quality of youth that makes enormous risk look like reasonable adventure. She talked about what the early years here had been, the hard seasons and the good ones, the building of something that felt like a life. She was careful around the edges of Clara, but she did not avoid her entirely. And when she mentioned her daughter, it was with the practiced steadiness of someone who has decided that love does not become smaller by being named. They walked to the bend in the creek and stood there for a while, and Calvin picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the low water with the automatic ease of a man who has been doing this since childhood, and Pearl said, "I haven't skipped a stone since I was about 12. "It doesn't go away," he said, handing her one. "It's the same as riding a bicycle." "There are no bicycles in Dustcreek," she said. "Bad example," he agreed. She threw the stone. It skipped twice. "There," he said, with a kind of warm satisfaction that was entirely out of proportion to the achievement, and Pearl laughed, and the laugh surprised her, coming out full and unguarded before she could moderate it, and Calvin looked at her with an expression that she felt in her chest before she had time to interpret it. They walked back when the light started to fade, and he walked her to her gate without ceremony, and tipped his hat, and she went inside and stood in her kitchen listening to the sound of his footsteps on the road until she could not hear them anymore. She stood there a while after that. She took Clara's locket from the shelf where she had placed it, ran her thumb across the smooth silver, opened the sticky clasp with the patience she had relearned, and looked at the small photograph inside, the serious face, the white collar. "I don't know what I'm doing, baby," she said quietly to the photograph, "in the way you speak to people you love who are no longer present. I don't know what I'm doing at all." The photograph, of course, said nothing. But Pearl felt, in the particular way of a mother who has loved a very specific child, that Clara would have had several opinions on the matter and would not have kept them to herself. She closed the locket and put it back on the shelf and went to make her supper. Christmas arrived and the church held its service and the town gathered, and Calvin sat 2 pews behind Pearl as usual, and afterward, in the cold, bright churchyard, he said Merry Christmas with the same directness he applied to everything, and she said Merry Christmas back, and there was a moment between them that lasted about 2 seconds longer than any previous such moment, and Pearl looked away first, which she registered but did not examine. In January, it was cold enough to be serious about it, and Pearl spent more time indoors, and so did most of Dustcreek. But she found herself going to Dora's store more often than strictly necessary, which she told herself was for the company and told herself was not for any other reason, and Dora had the wisdom not to press the matter. Calvin came in one afternoon during a particular January cold spell to buy lamp oil and a bag of dried beans, and he came in with actual color in his face from the cold, and a particular energy that Pearl had not seen before, and he told Abe Hatch that a family called the Murphys, who had a small spread 8 miles east of town, had lost their barn to a fire the night before and were in a serious situation. "I'm going out tomorrow to help with the build," he said. "Anyone else who wants to come, it won't take long with enough hands." Abe said he would come. 3 other men in the store said they would come. Pearl said, "I'll send food." Calvin looked at her. "That would help considerably," he said. She spent the next morning baking, which was a serious and purposeful task, and by mid-afternoon she had 2 pies, a large pot of beans that she had been working since the night before, and a substantial amount of cornbread, and she loaded all of it onto Patience and drove the mule out to the Murphy place. The walls of the new barn were already half up when she arrived, a ragged collection of men working in the January cold with their breath coming in clouds, and she set up the food on a trestle table near the house, and the Murphy family, a quiet woman and her husband and 3 children ranging from 6 to 12, greeted her with a gratitude that was almost painful in its sincerity. Calvin came off the wall when the food appeared, because he was a practical man, and he got himself a bowl of beans and stood near the table and looked at Pearl with an expression that was direct and warm in equal measure. "You didn't have to do all of this," he said. "People need feeding," she said, filling a bowl for herself because she had been working since the night before and she was hungry. "That's not complicated." "It's kindly done," he said. They ate standing up in the cold with the sound of hammers going behind them, and Pearl talked to Mrs. Murphy, whose first name was Helen, about the fire and about the children, and about whether the winter would break early. And all the while she was aware of Calvin beside her with the particular awareness she had been trying not to name for 2 months now. By the time Pearl drove Patience home in the late afternoon with empty pots, she had decided to name it. She sat at her kitchen table in the early dark, and she said the thing to herself plainly, which was something she had learned was the only effective way to manage difficult truths. She had feelings for Calvin Sullivan. She had been developing them quietly and without her full consent since October, and they had arrived now at a point where pretending otherwise was simply a waste of her own time. She was not a woman who wasted time. This did not mean she intended to do anything about it immediately. Pearl Fairchild did not rush things, but she stopped arguing with herself about what she felt, and the cessation of that argument was itself a relief she had not expected. February brought a brief warm spell, the kind that Texas sometimes offered as a false promise in the middle of winter, 3 days of air soft enough that you could be outdoors without suffering. Pearl was in her kitchen garden on the second of these days, not because there was much to do in February, but because she liked to check on things, liked to know what was happening in the ground, when she heard the gate and looked up to see Calvin Sullivan coming up the path, hat in hand, with a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who has decided to say something. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, and then stopped. "Calvin," she said, straightening up and brushing her hands on her apron. He looked at the garden, then at the sky, then at her, and she could see him deciding to just say it directly, which she appreciated. "I've been wondering," he said, "whether you would consider having supper with me, at the hotel, not for any particular occasion, just supper." He paused. "I'd like to spend an evening talking with you without being in Dora Hatch's store or standing in a field." Pearl was quiet for a moment, but it was not the sharp silence of a refusal gathering itself. It was a thinking silence, and he seemed to understand the difference because he waited without pressing. "I haven't had supper with a man since Robert died," she said. "Not that kind of supper." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him. She thought about the locket he had carried 8 months in 6 states because it felt wrong to leave it in a box. She thought about the way he listened when she talked about Clara. She thought about the stone skipping twice on the creek water and the warm satisfaction in his voice when it did. "Saturday," she said. 7 o'clock. He said good evening, and she watched him go back through the gate with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has accomplished something. And she put her hands back in the garden dirt because it was warm, and she needed something grounding for a moment. The hotel in Dustcreek had a dining room that served 3 or 4 tables on weekend evenings. Nothing elaborate, but clean and decent, with actual tablecloths and candles in glass holders, and it was the closest thing Dustcreek had to a proper restaurant. Pearl wore her good dark dress, the one she usually reserved for church, and put her hair up more carefully than usual, not excessively, just more carefully, and arrived at the hotel at 1 minute before 7 to find Calvin already there, also in a good coat, also looking slightly more considered than usual, and looking at her when she walked in with a directness that made her straighten slightly under it. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and a girl brought them coffee and they talked. They talked for 3 hours. The food came and they ate it and kept talking. They talked about things they had not gotten to in their previous conversations, the deeper strata of a person's life that only surface when the more immediate things have been said. Calvin talked about his years of moving and what they had given him, and also what they had cost him, the difficulty of not putting down roots when you are made for putting down roots. He said this plainly, without sentiment, as a person states a plain fact about themselves that they have come to understand. Pearl talked about what it had been like to rebuild after 1882, not just materially but internally, the way you have to relearn who you are when the things that organized your sense of yourself are gone. She said this also plainly, because he was the kind of person you could say plain things to. At some point during the 3rd cup of coffee, Calvin reached across the table and placed his hand over hers for a moment, not gripping or pressing, just present. And she looked at their hands on the tablecloth and did not move away, and after a moment he moved his hand back, and they kept talking. When he walked her home, it was late by Dustcreek standards, nearly 10 o'clock, and the sky was enormous above them with stars. At her gate he stopped, and she stopped, and they stood in the cold dark. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "So would I," Pearl said, which was not a complicated thing to say but felt significant to have said. He said good night, and she went in, and she stood in her kitchen for a while holding the edge of the table, not because she needed steadying, but because it was something to hold on to while she processed the fact that the evening had felt entirely and unexpectedly right. She did not sleep until late, and she woke in the morning feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like something good was coming toward her. They had supper again the following Saturday, and they walked twice the week between. And by the beginning of March, it was understood by Pearl and by Calvin and by virtually every resident of Dustcreek, which is a kind of place where these things become understood very quickly, that something was happening between them. The town had an opinion about this, which it expressed in the way of small towns through a mixture of approval, curiosity, and in one or two cases, a certain sourness from men who had been refused by Pearl, and who found the situation instructive in ways they would rather not be instructed. Sheriff Lon Meade, who had been among Pearl's suitors, had the grace to greet Calvin in a civil way and did not make things unpleasant, which Pearl respected. Thomas Gale had a word or two to say at his saloon about strangers taking what belonged to the town, which was a perspective that reached Pearl through Dora, and which Pearl dismissed with the same economy she applied to most things she found unworthy of serious engagement. What mattered was the thing itself. The thing itself was growing in Pearl in the way that spring grows, not a single dramatic event but a daily accumulation of small warmings, 1 degree at a time, until one morning you look around and everything has changed. Calvin was steady and he was patient and he was honest. He did not perform. He did not try to be something he was not in order to impress her. He was simply himself, the same self in March as he had been in September, and Pearl, who had spent years being wary of people's performances, found this consistency deeply moving. He talked about Mary with the same openness she talked about Clara and Robert, not as a way of staying in the past, but as a way of being honest about where he had come from. He did not pretend to be a man without history. Pearl had never trusted people without history. In March, on a warm afternoon that announced spring with genuine conviction, they sat on Pearl's porch, and Calvin had his coffee and Pearl had hers, and they had been talking about nothing in particular for a while, and the comfortable silence had fallen between them, and Calvin said into it, quietly, "Pearl, I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I've spent 7 years moving because staying anywhere felt like a weight I couldn't manage," he said. "I've been in Dustcreek 6 months and I haven't felt that once. I stay here and I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be." He paused. "And I think a considerable part of that is because you're here. And I think it's only fair to tell you that." Pearl set down her cup. She looked at the yard, at the small brown garden in its winter remnants waiting for warmth, at Patience standing philosophically against the fence. "Calvin," she said, "I have not let anyone near me in 2 years. I told myself it was grief, and then I told myself it was practicality, and then I ran out of things to tell myself." She looked at him. "I'm not running out of things to tell myself around you. And that is the most honest thing I can say." He was quiet for a moment, taking this in with the care he brought to things. "That's enough," he said. "I'm not in a hurry, I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. That was the thing. She simply believed him. What followed was not a sudden transformation but a deepening, like water working into ground that has been dry for a long time, slowly saturating. They spent evenings together with regularity, sometimes at her house, sometimes walking, sometimes at the hotel. Calvin began, with Pearl's permission, to do small repairs on her property, not out of a need to be useful, but because he had noticed that the porch railing needed attention and her fence posts were soft in two places. And a man who works with his hands all day finds it natural to turn those hands toward things that need doing. Pearl cooked for him sometimes, not because she felt obligated but because she wanted to, which was a different thing entirely. Dora watched all of this with the deep satisfaction of a good woman who has watched a friend be unhappy for 2 years and is now watching something else happen. By April, Calvin had begun to talk about the smithy not as a temporary arrangement, but as something he was building toward, a proper business, a stake in Dustcreek's future. He talked about this the way a person talks about something when they are talking about staying. Pearl heard this for what it was and felt it settle somewhere inside her as something solid. One evening in late April, sitting on her porch in the new spring warmth, Calvin reached over and took her hand, not in the tentative way of someone testing permission, but in the plain, straightforward way of a man who has decided. Pearl looked at their hands together and felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that until dark, talking about nothing in particular, watching the spring sky change colors. "I love you," Calvin said. He said it simply, without preamble, the way he said most things, and it landed on Pearl with the weight of something that had been building for months and had now simply arrived. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was feeling the fullness of it, the realness of it, the fact that this good and steady and patient man sitting on her porch in the April evening had said those words and meant them entirely. "I love you too," she said. And she did. She had known it for a while, in the way you know something that you have been watching come for some time, and saying it out loud was not a leap but an arrival. Something that had been almost closed inside her for 2 years opened the rest of the way, quietly and without drama, and let him in. Calvin lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and warm, and then set their joined hands back in his lap, and Pearl leaned her head against his shoulder, the first time she had leaned on anyone in 2 years, and felt the solid warmth of him and thought that this was what safety felt like when it was freely chosen rather than simply happened upon. He proposed in May. He did it on the church bench where they had first sat together, which Pearl thought was either sentimentally calculated or genuinely intuitive, and which turned out, when she asked him about it later, to be the latter. He did not make a speech. He had the ring which he had bought in Abilene on a trip he had taken for smithy supplies, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, and he held it between his thumb and forefinger and said, "Pearl, I want to spend the rest of my life here with you. I want to build something with you. I want to be a person who stays." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Pearl looked at the ring. She thought about Clara's locket traveling 8 months through 6 states in the pocket of a man it had never belonged to until it came home. She thought about the ways the world sometimes arranged things in patterns that made no logical sense, but made a deeper kind of sense if you were willing to look at them. She thought about the January morning when she had finally admitted to herself what she felt, and the February afternoon when she had said yes to supper, and the April evening when they had said the words out loud on the porch in the warm dark. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which felt like another one of those impossible small perfections, and he held her hand with both of his, and Pearl looked at the ring and then at him, and felt a happiness that was not the uncomplicated happiness of youth, but was something richer and harder one, built on understanding rather than innocence, and was for that reason more valuable. They were married in Dustcreek's church on a Saturday in June, when the Texas summer was in full voice, and the cottonwoods along the creek were as green as they would ever be. Dora Hatch cried, which she had told Pearl she would absolutely not do, and then did immediately and without apology. Abe Hatch shook Calvin's hand with the approval of a man who has done a small amount of engineering in the background of something, and is pleased with the results. The Henderson boy was there with his mother, and looked at the proceedings with the serious attention of a child who is cataloging a significant event. Pearl wore a dress the color of cream, not white, because she was not a woman who pretended to be something she was not, but clean and beautiful. And she had flowers in her hair from her own kitchen garden. And she stood at the front of the small church and said her vows to Calvin with the full, clear voice of a woman who is certain of what she is doing. Calvin's voice, when he said his vows, had a roughness at the edges that he did not try to clear away, and Pearl loved him for that, for the fact that he let her see that this moved him, that he was not too composed to be moved. When the Reverend declared them husband and wife, Calvin kissed her with a gentleness that held everything they were to each other, and Pearl felt the church around them, and the June light coming through the windows, and the warmth of her friends, and the particular feeling of a door opening in the right direction. They had their wedding supper at the hotel, the whole table occupied by Dora and Abe, and the Murphys who came in from their rebuilt farm, and old Pete Garner and the Henderson family, and a handful of others who had become, over the past months, something like Pearl's community in the genuine sense, rather than just the geographical one. There was actual music, the fiddler from the Friday dances, and there was dancing in the hotel's modest parlor, and Calvin danced with Pearl 3 times, no longer stiff, no longer trying too hard, just dancing with his wife in the warm light of a June evening. They walked home to Pearl's house, which was now their house in the late evening, with the summer stars overhead and the creek frogs going in the distance, and at the gate Calvin picked Pearl up before she quite knew what was happening, which made her laugh with a startled brightness that she felt go all the way through her, and carried her through the door of their home. The summer was the best Pearl had known in years. She did not think of it in terms of comparison exactly, but she noticed the quality of it, the way the days felt full in a way they had not for a long time. Calvin set up a proper smithy with a new sign. Sullivan and Sons was what it said, and Pearl raised an eyebrow at the Sons part, and Calvin said he was planning ahead, with a look that was both serious and warm, and Pearl felt a bloom of something in her chest that she took her time with. They talked about children. They talked about it honestly, in the way 2 adults who have each lost something irreplaceable talk about the possibility of more. Pearl said that she had thought for a long time that she was done with hoping, and that she was not entirely sure she was not still too afraid to hope. Calvin said that whatever came, he was here for it, for all of it, the hoping and the being afraid and everything that followed from either. He said this looking directly at her and meaning every word, and Pearl believed him, and that was enough to allow the hope in. By August, she knew. She told Calvin on a Tuesday morning quietly in the kitchen, while the coffee was still brewing. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and watched his face. He went very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was so open it was almost difficult to see, joy and seriousness and something like reverence all at once. "Pearl," he said. "I know," she said. He pulled her into his arms and held her there, and she felt his breath, slow and steady against her hair, and she closed her eyes. She went to see the doctor, who was better at babies than he was at teeth, and received confirmation with the matter-of-fact cheerfulness of a man who had delivered most of Dustcreek's current generation. Calvin went with her, sitting in the small waiting room with his hat in his hands in the exact attitude he had had on the day he walked into Dora's store, except that now the patience in it was a different kind of patience, anticipatory rather than uncertain. Dora cried again when Pearl told her. "You have to stop crying every time something good happens to me," Pearl said. "It's very unsettling." "I cannot control it," Dora said, entirely unabashed. "This is wonderful and I am going to cry." Autumn came again, a full year since Calvin had ridden into Dustcreek on his bay horse, and the town looked different to Pearl now in the way places look different when you are happy in them. The same buildings, the same road, the same creek and the same bare-branched cottonwoods, but with a quality of belonging she had not felt here in a long time. Calvin expanded the smithy in October, taking on a young man named Sam Belcher as an apprentice, a boy of 18 who had good hands and enormous patience, and who looked at the forge with the same expression the Henderson boy always had, though Sam's was the professional version. Calvin taught with the same quality he brought to everything, thoroughgoing and without condescension, the way the old blacksmith in Kansas City had taught him. Pearl's pregnancy was an unremarkable one in the best sense of the phrase, steady and progressing as expected, without the alarms that the frontier doctor was occasionally obliged to respond to. She continued her routines through the autumn, modified slightly, and she found that she was not afraid the way she had expected to be. She had thought the fear of losing again would be paralyzing. Instead, she found that hope, once it had come back into a house, had a warmth that kept the cold out. Calvin was attentive without being smothering. He noticed when she was tired and did not comment on it directly, merely arranged for things to be easier without explaining why. He had a quality of practical tenderness, arriving at the right thing through common sense rather than sentiment, that Pearl found deeply well suited to her. In the evenings of that autumn and early winter, they sat by the fire after supper and Calvin sometimes read aloud from whatever book or newspaper he had, and Pearl sewed, and they talked when they felt like talking and were quiet when they didn't. Pearl kept Clara's locket on the mantelpiece where she could see it from her chair, and sometimes in the firelight she would look at it and feel the whole shape of the past 2 years, all of it, the loss and the closing and the carrying and the opening back up, and feel it as something complete rather than something broken. She told Calvin once, sitting like this, that she thought Clara would have liked him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, and then he said, "Tell me why you think that." So she told him. She talked about Clara's feeling for animals and Clara's questions and Clara's box of interesting things, and the way Clara had of deciding immediately whether a person was worth her time, which had been remarkably accurate for a 7-year-old. She said that Clara had always responded to people who took her seriously and who did not talk down to her, and that Calvin was precisely that kind of person. Calvin listened and nodded, and when she finished he said, "I think I would have liked her too." "I know you would have," Pearl said. "That's how I know she would have liked you." The baby came in March, on a cold, clear morning with the spring trying and not quite managing to get started, while Calvin sat in the kitchen very close to coming apart at the seams in the way of composed men who have arrived at the limit of their composure. The doctor and Dora were in the bedroom, and Calvin paced in the kitchen and prayed in the direct and minimal way of a man who does not pray elaborately, but means it completely. When Dora came to the door and said, "Come in," Calvin crossed the hall in 3 steps, and Pearl was there, propped against the pillows with the specific exhausted radiance of a woman who has done something enormous, and she was holding a wrapped bundle, and she looked at Calvin with eyes that were wet and bright and steady all at the same time. "Come and see," she said. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, because it was a son, a solid and apparently resolved little person with Pearl's dark eyes and Calvin's general air of having decided something. Calvin put out one finger and the tiny fist closed around it with the automatic grip of the newborn, fierce and trusting at the same time, and Calvin made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "What do we call him?" Pearl asked, though they had talked about names and had something in mind, but this was the moment of confirming it. "Robert James Sullivan," Calvin said. Robert for Pearl's first husband, because Calvin was a man who understood that honoring what had come before was not a diminishment of what was present, and James for Calvin's own father. Pearl had agreed to this without hesitation when he had proposed it. "Robert James," Pearl said, looking at the baby. "Hello, we've been expecting you." The winter that had been holding on let go properly that April, and Dustcreek went into a spring that was gentler than the previous one, with enough rain to bring the creek up and green the ridge hills in a way they weren't always green. Robert James Sullivan, who was called Rob almost immediately by the entire population of Dustcreek, because that was how these things went, grew with the healthy insistence of a baby who has decided on being present in the world. He was loud and opinionated, which Pearl regarded as both expected and appropriate. Calvin was a father with the same steadiness he brought to everything else. He held Rob in the smithy sometimes when Pearl needed her hands for something, and brought the baby to watch the work with the serious interest of a man introducing a person to the world. The Henderson boy, now 10, appointed himself Rob's honorary older cousin, and visited with a reliability that eventually became simply assumed. Pearl watched Calvin with their son, and felt the love she had for him take on new dimensions. It was one thing to be loved by a person. It was another thing to watch that person love someone else you love with the same quality of wholeness. She thought sometimes, looking at the three of them on the porch in the warm evenings of that first summer, that she had been given back something she had thought was gone for good, not the same thing. Nothing could be the same thing, but something of equal value, which was more than she had dared to ask for. The locket stayed on the mantelpiece. Pearl had decided, after some thought, that she would not wear it, not because she was putting Clara away, but because Clara belonged to the mantelpiece now, in the place of honor, where she could be seen from the kitchen and from the chair by the fire, and from the front door when you came in from outside. She was part of the house. She was part of what had brought Calvin here. Pearl had told Rob about Clara, from the time he was an infant too young to understand, because she had decided that her daughter would not be a silence in this house. By the time Rob was old enough to ask questions, he would know that he had a sister who had gone before him, and that she had been curious and brave and entirely herself, and that she was loved. The summer of 1885 was a full one. Calvin's smithy was doing steady business, and Sam Belcher was developing into a proper blacksmith with good instincts. Pearl's kitchen garden was the best it had ever been, partly because of a particularly good spring, and partly because Calvin had spent 2 evenings in April improving the drainage, and the produce it gave was more than she could use herself, which meant she had things to bring to Dora's store for resale, which added a small income of her own that she liked for its independence. The town was growing in the careful way that small frontier towns sometimes managed to grow in the 1880s, new families coming through and some of them stopping, a new schoolhouse being discussed by the town council that Calvin had joined at Abe Hatch's insistence. Pearl liked watching the town grow. It was different from when she had first come here with Robert, when the future had felt both enormous and precarious. Now she felt herself to be part of something that had a chance of lasting, and she put that feeling to use in practical ways, involving herself in the schoolhouse discussion with the opinions of a woman who had thought seriously about what children needed. This surprised no one who knew Pearl and astonished everyone who did not. One evening in September, exactly 1 year after Calvin had first ridden into Dustcreek on his bay horse, they sat on the porch in the warm September dark, and Rob was asleep inside, and the creek frogs were going, and Pearl thought about the full measure of the year. "What are you thinking about?" Calvin asked. "The day you rode in," she said. "A year ago." "What about it?" he asked. "I was in Dora's store," she said, "and I saw the chain in your pocket, and I thought I was losing my reason." She paused. "I wasn't expecting any of this. I want you to know that. I had entirely stopped expecting anything like this." He reached over and took her hand, which he still did with the same ease as the first time, natural and unhurried. "Neither was I," he said. "I was going to ride on through. I've been doing that for years. I just stopped because I thought Dustcreek might need a blacksmith and I wanted a night off the road." "And you had a locket in your pocket that belonged to my daughter," Pearl said. "And I had a locket in my pocket that belonged to your daughter," he agreed. They were quiet for a while with the fullness of the year between them. "Calvin," Pearl said. "I'm grateful every day," she said. "I want you to know that." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it, the old-fashioned gesture he had made on the night they first said the words, and held it against his face for a moment. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." Winter came again and was milder than the last, and by the following spring Pearl knew she was expecting again, which she told Calvin in the same Tuesday morning kitchen way as before, and received the same still, open expression on his face as before, and thought that some moments bore repeating. This time Dora only cried a little, which Pearl considered progress. The second baby arrived in November of 1886, a girl, which meant that Rob at 19 months was going to have a sister, which struck Pearl as appropriate in ways she did not always try to articulate. The girl was born in the evening, with the oil lamp lit against the November dark, and Pearl held her while Calvin sat beside her with his arm around Pearl's shoulders and looked at his daughter. Clara Ann Sullivan, Pearl said, because they had agreed on this also, and Calvin had been the one to suggest it, which had told Pearl everything she needed to know about the man she had married. Clara Ann, Calvin said, looking at the small, dark head. It suits her, Pearl said. She looked across the room at the mantelpiece, at the small silver locket with the photograph inside, the circle of it, the way things moved and came back and were given again in new forms. She had been thinking lately that this was perhaps how loss worked, not a replacement but a continuation, life insisting on itself in new shapes while the old ones remained exactly as they were, neither gone nor diminished, simply held alongside the new. She had asked Dora once, in a candid conversation in the store, whether she thought it was wrong to be happy again after what had happened. Dora had looked at her with the directness of a good friend and said, "Pearl Fairchild, if any human being on this earth has earned the right to be happy, it is you. And furthermore, I think the people you love who are gone would find it nothing but a comfort." Pearl had thought about this often since then, and had come to believe it. Young Clara Ann was, within weeks of arriving, clearly going to be a force of nature. She ate with purpose and slept with opinion and regarded the world with dark eyes that reminded Pearl, with a sweetness that was now entirely without the old edge of pain, of a little girl who had once collected rocks and feathers and pressed flowers and asked questions without waiting for the answers. Rob, for his part, regarded his sister with the careful fascination of a toddler who has been told something important is happening and is not yet sure whether he approves but is leaning in that direction. Calvin declared the two of them to be the most specific human beings he had ever encountered, which Pearl thought was the most accurate summary. The town of Dustcreek, which had observed all of this with the attentive interest of a small town that takes its residents' lives seriously, had largely come to regard the Sullivans as a fixture, the kind of family around which a community orients itself without entirely meaning to. Calvin was on the school board now and well liked for his directness and his refusal to waste anyone's time. Pearl had become, somewhat against her original intention, the person other women in town came to when they needed someone to talk to who would listen carefully and say true things. Dora called this inevitable, and Pearl called it mildly inconvenient, but she did not stop doing it. In the spring of 1887, the new schoolhouse opened, the one the council had been discussing since before Rob was born. It was a proper building with real windows and 2 rooms, and a teacher who had come from San Antonio, and who had the focused energy of a young woman who had decided that education on the frontier was her calling, and was going to pursue it with everything she had. Pearl helped with the curtains and Calvin built the window frames, and Sam Belcher made the hardware, and the Henderson boy, now 12, attended as one of the first students. Rob was still too small for school, but Pearl took him to see the building on the day it opened, and he looked at it with the round-eyed seriousness of a 2-year-old considering the future, and Pearl thought about what kind of person he would become in rooms like this one. She thought about Clara, who had gone to a smaller school in a worse building, and had loved it extravagantly because she loved everything that contained information. She thought about how Clara would have taken this new building completely for granted, and then wrung every possible thing out of it. She thought these things without the old pain, just with the warm constancy of memory that has been made peace with, and she went home and found Calvin in the yard with Rob on his shoulders, both of them looking at something in the tree, a bird or a squirrel. the small drama of the natural world that children find infinitely compelling, and she stood at the gate watching them for a moment before they noticed her. Calvin looked over and saw her and smiled, the full and uncalculated smile she had been seeing for 2.5 years now, and which still had the same effect on her as the first time she had properly seen it, which was to make something warm move through her chest in a way that she no longer tried to moderate. She went through the gate into the yard. Rob made the noise he made when he saw her, which was her name but mangled in the specific way of a toddler still working out consonants, and Calvin handed him down into her arms, and Rob patted her face with both hands with the affectionate ownership of young children for their mothers. "What were you looking at?" she asked. "Hawk," Calvin said. "Hunting." "Did it catch anything?" Pearl asked, carrying Rob toward the house. "Not while we were watching," Calvin said, walking beside her. "But it wasn't giving up." Pearl laughed and Rob laughed because she laughed, which was one of the best things about small children, that they laughed in sympathy without needing to know the reason. They went inside, into the warm house, and Calvin started the supper fire while Pearl set Rob down to play with the block of wood that was currently his most important possession. And little Clara Ann woke from her afternoon sleep in the basket near the hearth, and announced this with considerable volume. And Pearl went to pick her up and walked her to the window to look at the late afternoon light on the creek hills, and the whole of it was present and complete and fully real. Pearl stood there with her daughter in her arms and looked at the March light on the hills and thought about the full length of the journey that had brought her here, all the grief and the closing and the cold years of just managing, and the September afternoon when she had seen a thin silver chain in a stranger's pocket, and her whole composure had cracked just slightly, just enough to let something in. She looked at Clara Ann's round face, the dark eyes looking back at her with the total frank attention of a baby who has not yet learned to look at anything less than fully. "Your sister would have had entirely too many opinions about you," Pearl said to her daughter. "And you would have adored every single one of them." Calvin, who was at the fire and had heard this, looked over his shoulder at Pearl with a quiet warmth that asked nothing of her and offered everything. Pearl smiled at him, the full and unguarded kind. He turned back to the fire and she went back to the window, holding her daughter, watching the light change on the hills, and inside the good and solid house that had been built by a decent man and was now lived in by a full life. The silver locket on the mantelpiece caught the last of the afternoon sun and held it for a moment, bright and small and entirely itself, before the day closed in and the lamplight took over, and supper came and the children were settled and the fire burned down to coals. And Pearl Fairchild, who was now Pearl Sullivan, and who had buried enough to know what surviving cost and what it was worth, leaned against her husband in the warm quiet of their home and felt, without reservation, at peace.